Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor James Robinson. Hello, James. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I am great, James. I've been reading you forever. Do democracies cause growth? You have written on that topic. You have written on institution. You're a highly cited economist.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, although you're being very polite, but you're a really big deal in economics. So, James, we're going to hit the ground running by talking about Botswana. Landlocked countries are often poor. In Africa, geography is an impediment to growth and also malaria. But Botswana has done so well. During 1965 to 1995, Botswana recorded the fastest growth rate in the world. Why? Why is Botswana so different?
Well, I think Botswana was able to do the sort of things that every economist know lead to economic growth. It was able to invest in education and the human capital of its citizens. It was able to build kind of infrastructure, public goods. It had very good economic institutions in terms of secure property rights and kind of inclusion. So I think that what Botswana was able to do was it was able to create what we call inclusive economic institutions in our book Why Nations Fail, and that created incentives and opportunities for people to flourish economically, and the society flourished. So the puzzling thing, or at least if you look at Africa, what seems anomalous about Botswana is why they were able to do that, when so many African countries, or the majority of African countries, were not able to do that. And I think that's to do both with the nature of pre-colonial Tswana political institutions and the way Tswana political elites, when they were incorporated into the British Empire, were able to kind of negotiate with the British Empire to preserve a kind of autonomy and continuity, and the way they were able to build kind of a post-colonial society which was sort of legitimate and which incorporated traditional notions of legitimate authority and governance. So I think what was somehow unique about the place was, what emerged as the independent Republic of Botswana kind of corresponded to a set of pre-colonial Tswana societies that shared similar institutions, and so there was a continuity between pre-colonial and post-colonial, which you could say is unusual in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's also to do not just with that, but also the nature of those institutions, those political institutions, I think.
Let me read an excerpt from your paper titled State Formation and Governance in Botswana, and Q. Neil Parsons is also one of the authors. And I begin. But our analysis begins with the puzzle. How did Botswana develop a legal, rational state? We suggest that three key interlinked factors were important. First, during the pre-colonial period, the Tswana developed local states with relatively limited kingship or chiefship, and with a political structure that was able to integrate people of other ethnic groups, such as the Kalanga. Second, facing the onslaught first of the Boers, next of the British South Africa Company, and finally of the Union of South Africa, Tswana political elites attempted to maintain a good measure of independence by defensively modernizing. Finally, the political elites in both local states before independence and the national state at independence heavily invested in the country's most important economic activity, ranching.
That's
Yes,
right.
quite poignant. There's many writers, including other economists and historians, in recent years they have been fixating on the role of pre-colonial institutions in generating modern development. One writer is Jutta Bolt. She also has a paper on pre-colonial development in Africa, and the Botswana was compared to the Asante Empire. So the argument is that the Asante Empire also had institutions that were proto-democratic, and it's not surprising that Ghana, and for those who may be unaware, Asante was the imperial power on the Gold Coast. Today, it's Ghana. The capital of Asante was Kumasi, but we just refer to Asante today as Ghana, but Ghana was quite receptive to pro-market reforms. So James, I'm wondering if there is a link between pre-colonial institutions and receptivity to reform in the contemporary era.
I mean, I think parts of Africa where there's more continuity between pre-colonial and post-colonial political institutions tend to do better. That's for sure, because it's been easier to create a sort of post-colonial social contract. I think if you look at a country like Nigeria or the Democratic Republic of Congo, which are incredibly heterogeneous, that makes it a much more difficult political problem. I think so. So I think in the sense that I would say Ghana is much more heterogeneous than Botswana is. In the sense that yes, you have this Asante empire, in the south, but you had other things in the south too, like the Fanti states.
Yes.
You have in the north, you have Dagomba, you have very different type of political society in the north. So that's more heterogeneous. But I think Jutta Bolt, she's a big expert on Botswana also. But I think she's right. That there's a sort of that greater continuity in between post-colonial and pre-colonial that's helped African societies create better governance and more stable social contracts. Yeah.
And Bolt, she also argued that there's a slight relationship between exogamy and the receptivity to reform, in the sense that countries that are more open to new people and ideas, there's a slight relationship between their ability to reform in modern societies when compared to their counterparts. It's a slight relationship.
Yeah, there might be. I'm not sure how she
Yeah,
measured
yeah,
that.
yeah. She didn't get deeply into it, but I think it's an interesting area of research. I'm fascinated by the link between exogamy and development. I'm wondering if people who are more likely to marry outside of their kin group, if they're also more likely to innovate.
I don't know what the evidence on that is, actually.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I've never seen the evidence. I don't know what the
Yeah,
systematic.
I don't know either, but the best data we have is a paper written by Joseph Enrich and some co-authors, and they're studying the link between kinship intensity and impersonal trust. So far, this is the best evidence we have been managed to furnish.
Yeah, I know Joe Henrich's work. Yeah, I know his work, but I think he has. I have issues with some of it. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but
All right, you may go ahead. What are your issues? Joe Henrich is the big guy now in economics. Everybody's reading weird.
I think he has a very sort of genetically based model of like what kinship is about, for example. Like I would say, based on my experience in Africa, people have many different sorts of identities. Kinship, relationships are often fictional as much as genetic. He sort of has this very biological, genetically based view of relationships, which I find not terribly kind of useful in thinking about identities and how people relate to each other. And so for example, in many African languages, many African kinship systems, they have these very straight, simple ways of referring to everybody. Everybody is brother, sister, father, mother. You don't have this very complicated cousin, aunt, uncle, nephew, niece, kind of this very complicated way of referring to genetic kin. So you have this very flexible system. So everyone is in Congo, everyone is your brother, everyone is your sister. I think most Westerners who kind of, you go to Africa for the first time, you find this terribly confusing because people refer to everybody as their brother and their sister. And you think, is that your brother? Like you've never called someone your brother. They're not people who are genetically related to you, but that's just the kinship terminology. But that's a very powerful way of kind of building what anthropologists would call fictive kinship relations. To me, this very genetically based biological model of human society doesn't actually do a very good job of explaining the way human society works. So I guess my major problem with his work is that he comes out of that's where he's coming from, this sort of biological model, and I don't find that a very useful way of thinking about human society, to be honest with you.
All right, then, quite frank. As a student, we studied African history, and as such, were exposed to the various perspectives exploring identity. Some argue that identity was created in the colonial period. Some contend that Africans always had identity, and then there's the view that identity is flexible. But I think the broader point that that Joseph is highlighting is that due to lineage, whether it be a patrilineal lineage or matrilineal lineage, people are embedded in clan society. So after a period of several centuries, the children of your great granduncle may just be a friend. You may not know that you're biologically related, but due to culture, your neighbor is your brother or your sister. I think that's the point that he's elucidating. But I do agree with you. Identity in Africa is a complicated issue. Some scholars have written that Africans show less out group trust and stronger in group trust. But again, this view is also disputed by others. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah, I worry that the way these questions are phrased, doesn't mean much, in different cultural contexts.
Yeah.
The world value, it's true in the world value survey. If you look at these questions of like, do you think most people can be trusted? Which is the way economists measure generalized trust. Africans tend, even people in Botswana, by the way, tend to answer, no, most people can't be trusted. But I don't know that that's the kind of relevant way that people think about. It's not, the question is, people like to kind of ask the question in the same way all over the world because they think that's sort of comparable. But it also means that you're asking it in a, you're not asking these questions in a culturally relevant way.
Yes.
So it worries me that I mean, for example, if people talk about trust as a measure of social capital or whatever, but for me, social capital, like, it's just incredibly high in Africa. If you look at other ways of measuring it, for example, the famous book by Putnam measures social capital by looking at associational life. Africans have much denser associational life than people in the West. I mean, I was just I came back from Eastern Nigeria a week ago, and there everyone's a member of all these associations and groups and age grades and councils, and there's just so much kind of associational life that people interact with each other in a way which is much denser than people do in Western society. So is that, should I measure social capital like that, or should I measure social capital by this answer to the trust?
I think that the proxy is impersonal trust. So I agree with what you're saying. Africans still have very traditional cults and age societies, but maybe impersonal trust is lower. So for example, you're arguing that social capital is relatively high in Africa, but there are many studies pointing to the contrary.
Yeah, it depends how you measure it, I think. So I mean, I haven't done. Yeah, it depends how you measure it.
And another pertinent point is that although it is written in economics that trust predicts intelligence and social capital, in reality, intelligent people express calculated trust. So according to some studies, trust is negatively correlated with intelligence, because people who are intelligent, in order for them to trust you, they have to analyze your personality. Therefore, if you ask a serious person, do you trust strangers? More than likely, he's going to say no, because for you to benefit from the relationship, you must assess the person. It is gullible to trust someone you don't know. So the measurement variables can pose a problem. It's just like Denmark. It is often said that Denmark is collectivistic, and also that Sweden is closer to collectivism on the spectrum. But I read the World Values Survey, I read the Economist magazine, and many other studies, and they argue that the Danish and Swedish people value autonomy. So individualism predicts the adoption of technology, and Denmark, according to many studies, is an individualistic country. It's not as individualistic as America, but on average, people in Denmark and Sweden value autonomy. So we need to refine the measurement variables.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't know how much evidence there really is about I mean, I think I'm not quite sure I would think the distribution of intelligence is pretty constant across different societies and different parts of the world. I don't really think of that as kind of explaining. It could be true that, within the United States, however you measure intelligence, if you measure it by IQ or whatever, maybe there's systematic differences, between different people. But, to be honest with you, in any problem I've tried to understand, differences in intelligence never seem like an interesting way of thinking about it. So I don't have much to say about that.
I do agree with some extent, but I differ in the realm of intelligence. I think intelligence is the next frontier in economic research, and I've been seeing some good papers. But we're going to get back to Botswana. Post-colonial institutions in Botswana were also crucial. Unlike many countries in Africa, the government of Botswana did not lurch left. And in one of your papers, you actually distinguish between capitalism in Africa and socialism in Africa. And you gave an example of a country in Africa. It was in one of your earlier papers. Why was the government of Botswana more accepting of what we would call pro-market policies?
Well, I think there was a long tradition of, something that looks like capitalism in Botswana. Actually, if you go back to the 19th century, King Khama the Great, who was who became king of the Ngwato in 1875, who was like one of the big kind of reformers. He modernized all sorts of state institutions, social institutions. He actually set up a trading company to make money, trading with the South Africans. And so I think you see all over the place in Africa, commercially minded people, southern Nigeria in the 19th century. There's all sorts of commerce, trade everywhere. So again, I think African economic institutions in large parts of the, pre-colonial Africa were certainly different from market institutions that we're familiar with. But I think most of the evidence suggests that, when colonial penetration occurred and, all these economic opportunities emerged, then Africans were perfectly capable and willing to take advantage of them. I think like the distinction between Botswana and other places, and it's interesting to reflect on what happened to King Khama's trading company, it was put out of business by white people because the whites didn't like the competition. So South Africans basically got the British government to shut it down. So I think that's the story kind of in many parts of colonial Africa. White people wanted cheap workers, for their farms and mines. And so they didn't want, competing sources of employment. They wanted wages low, they wanted labor. And so I think, but, so why didn't that happen in Botswana? Well, it happened a little bit. There were migrant people going and working in the Rand from Botswana. But again, I think this goes back to something that we discussed earlier that you mentioned about the article with Neil Parsons, which is that Tswana chiefs were very sophisticated in terms of trying to kind of mitigate these negative forces. Yeah, they managed to shut down King Khama's trading company, but they generally managed to keep the British out and keep these influences to a minimum. And I think so that's part of this continuity, and I think that's part of the story, about why Botswana was able to flourish, and you mentioned the cows, the chiefs owned lots of cows, after independence, they developed the ranching industry into a very successful commercial enterprise, again, because they were willing and able to take advantage of these economic opportunities. So I think that's part of the continuity. But again, I think you see that everywhere, this ability to kind of take advantage of economic incentives. I don't think Africans are any different from anybody else from that perspective.
And markets are not unique to the Western world. I'm sure you're familiar with the writings of Garrett Austin. I think that the edge in the Western world is that Westerners institutionalized markets, limited liability companies, joint stock companies, the stock market, etc. And over time, Western culture became more conducive to entrepreneurial abilities. And again, contrary to what some believe, there's a point in Western history when entrepreneurs were not respected. But over time, as society progressed, the status of the entrepreneur in the Western imagination was elevated, and this contributed to the growth of Western societies. Whereas in Africa, Asia, and other societies, it took a longer period for people to truly appreciate the role of the entrepreneur. But entrepreneurship is not unique to the West. It is embedded in many non-Western societies. The edge is just that the West institutionalized entrepreneurship. What's your take on this issue?
Yeah, I think I think as Polanyi described it, in large parts of kind of pre-colonial Africa, markets and kind of economic activities were much more socially embedded. They were much more wrapped up with politics and and other social institutions. So they weren't, that there weren't the kind of same material incentives or material objectives that that emerged in, you could say, early modern or modern Europe, which spurred entrepreneurship and innovation. And I guess that's right. I guess that's right. But my sense is that many different sorts of societies are capable of sustaining capitalist development. Look at China. Chinese society is much more collectivist than Western society. In China, lineages and kinship and all sorts of social structure are there. They're present and they're powerful, but somehow the Chinese are able to kind of leverage those. And so I think that I think, like, my sense is that many of these things are more flexible than they might appear to be. So that, yeah, there is this narrative about individualism and entrepreneurship and whatever. And I mean, this is the narrative that Henrik likes, but about how the kind of the emergence of individuals, and I think there's something in that, but I wouldn't want to overdo it either.
Yeah, well, you keep referring to Heinrich. James, I don't agree with Heinrich on all issues. For example, there's compelling evidence to indicate that before the ascent of Christianity in the West, some parts of Western society were already individualistic. But based on my reading, individualism is the most robust cultural predictor of economic performance. And it is also correlated with many variables, even institutional quality and corruption.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think I agree with that. I don't know what the best research
Yeah,
is on that.
Gerard Rowland was on the show recently.
Yeah, but that's not. I mean, I just think that empirical work is not convincing, honestly.
I tell you.
You have to, first of all, you have to measure individualism. You have to take a stance on that, and I think that's not clear exactly how you measure that. And I think also you have to, there's many omitted variables which are correlated with these measures and economic development. I don't think many people in economics are convinced by that research, honestly.
James, you are hard not to crack. Yeah, it would be interesting for me to watch a debate with you and some of these guys. But James, there's also another pressing issue. How is governance maintained? Because it is easy to build an institution, but it isn't easier to degrade it. Yes, Botswana had an advantage in the quality of its pre-colonial institutions, but nothing in history is inevitable. These institutions could have collapsed. Why were they maintained? Having a head start does not necessarily mean that you're always going to be successful.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's true, but I guess there is some, there's some element of persistence. I think, that there's a lot of continuity in the way politics has worked in Botswana. And, and the pre-colonial political legitimacy was kind of projected into post-colonial world. I don't know. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I mean, I agree with you that, things can collapse and they can go into reverse. And, we talk about examples of that in Why Nations Fail. And institutions can be undermined. There's always incentives to create more extractive institutions, some inclusive societies, and and societies can go in the other direction as well. So I'm not sure I have anything deep to say about that, but I agree with you. But the fact of the matter is, they have but they have managed to to kind of persist. There has been all this persistence in Botswana, and there has been this deliberate strategies to kind of accentuate that. So for example, when the Botswana one of the reasons, Botswana was so neglected in the colonial period, it wasn't even governed. It was one of only 2 African colonies, that were governed outside of the colony. So it was run from Vryburg or Mafeking in South Africa. So when the British decided they were going to make it independent, there wasn't even a capital there. All the administration was out of the country. So they decided they'd build this capital at Gaborone. And when they built the capital at Gaborone, they built these hotlers. If you go around Gaborone, you can find these hotlers, which is like the traditional sort of institution of accountability. They kind of built them into this new city. So they built this new city, but they built the traditional institutions into the new city. So I find that a very kind of interesting example of, they valued a lot, these institutions, and they understood you had to kind of build on them and preserve them and modernize them, build them into this new state. And so there's been a lot of that in Botswana, and as a deliberate strategy. And, I don't know, because they value these institutions, because they see they work, and people, post-colonial political elites have worked to maintain them. I don't know, that's a very deep explanation, but I think that's what's happened.
Well, on this show, James, I like deep explanation, but because economics is so fascinating, I don't have a problem with an intelligent speculation. Many of my arguments are speculative because the research is yet to be done. So usually when I invite people like yourself, I always propose an hypothesis and say, maybe you should go and study this topic. So for example, bureaucracies. Some writers like Ranch argue that bureaucracies are major predictors of economic growth in complex societies. And again, according to the literature on Botswana and Mauritius, they built proper bureaucracies. Bureaucracies in these countries were never politicized. They employed the best and the brightest and often appropriated British policies, whereas in other parts of Africa and even the Caribbean, like Jamaica, for example, the bureaucracy was politicized. What's your analysis of the contribution of bureaucracy to development in Botswana?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what you see in Botswana is you see a lot of rational planning, you see a lot of bureaucratic capacity that allows for the diamond wealth to be used in the public interest. But again, I'd see that as an outcome of this political continuity that I was describing. The reason that the bureaucracy became very politicized in many parts of post-colonial Africa is just, there were all these political pressures that the institutions couldn't manage, to engage in patronage and to employ people. But in Botswana, they had legitimate ways of kind of managing political pressure, pressure to redistribute. And so they didn't need to politicize the bureaucracy because they had ways of dealing with this that they didn't have in Ghana or Nigeria or Zambia or whatever, So I would say that that's a sort of outcome of, it's an outcome of this continuity and legitimacy of political institutions.
I'm happy that you refer to neo-patrimonialism because in your paper there's a paragraph, and I will read some of it. An explanation of the incidence of neo-patrimonialism in Africa is therefore an explanation for why African states took a different path historically. The question has been addressed by Bates and Hopkins. Their explanation emphasizes first that African population density has been historically low, leading to less interstate warfare and less focus on defining territorial boundaries. Secondly, colonial powers had no interest in developing state capacity since they did not fight for territory in Africa, and since independence, the international community has enforced the colonially created national boundaries. A compelling point, quite poignant, but James, I'm sure you're familiar with James Fensky. He has a paper arguing that Africa is different in the context that warfare in Africa cannot explain state formation. And we're going to get to this later. You have a similar paper looking at the nexus between Africa and centralization and trade. So my question is simply this: why is Africa so different? Because the explanation for neo-patrimonialism in Africa does not hold for other places.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with anything I said, actually. I mean, I wrote that 20 years ago. My view on this is totally different nowadays. I think this argument of Herbst, I find totally wrong. So I wrote that a long time ago, and I guess my opinion has changed a lot about what's the origin of kind of state authority. And in Africa, I would say, I would change. I don't think warfare is very important, but to me, yeah. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, but I that's not the way I think about things anymore.
Yeah, good. And it's good because that's not what the data have been showing. Like you did a more recent paper arguing that trade and centralization do not explain state formation in Africa. So why is Africa so different, James?
Yeah, I think like what we try to do in this work that I did with Philip Osafu-Kwako is
Yes.
basically show that there's no correlation at all between population density and political centralization in pre-colonial Africa. So this idea that Herbst has is just totally inconsistent with the available data. So my view has been heavily shaped by the work of Jan van Sina, the
Yes.
historian
Yeah,
Jan
I'm
van
a fan
Sina.
of Jan van Tino.
Yeah, so van Sina's argument, basically is that, and this is actually something I'm trying to do research on at the moment in southern Nigeria, kind of get into this in a deeper way, is that, van Sina's argument is that, the big fact about African political development is that, Africa diverged from Eurasia in the sense of it didn't create these large, centralized, bureaucratized states the way, Eurasia did. And why did that? Well, in his view, it's because Africans just enormously kind of valued the autonomy, what he calls the autonomy of the local community. Africans liked living in small-scale political societies, and they resisted attempts to centralize authority. And they created all sorts of institutions which were sort of substitutes for centralized authority. So in his book, Pass in the Rainforest, for example, which is like his political history of the Congo Basin, he gives all these examples of different societies that sort of, they understood there were advantages of operating at scale, but they didn't want to have a state. So they created other things to substitute for a state, And so I guess that view, I think that's basically my view nowadays. So if you want to understand why African society is different, I think van Sina got it exactly right. It is true empirically. At the time of the scramble for Africa, probably 20% or less of the population of Africa lived in something like centralized states. Yeah, there were places like Ashanti, but that was the exception rather than the rule. And so I guess I've been trying to understand, what does that mean? Why is it that Africans value autonomy so much, and how is that represented in Africans' kind of worldviews or culture, or that van Sina never really answers that question. He sort of says, this is how Africans are, and he never gets deeper into that. But one of my kind of obsessions at the moment, which I'm trying to do in the south of eastern Nigeria, because this is a place where there were many politically uncentralized society, the Igbo,
Yes, the Igbos. I'm coming to the Igbos.
Yeah,
I love to talk about the Igbos.
Yeah, exactly. So that's actually a sort of super interesting case to try to understand what van Sina was talking about. So I think, the way that this quote that you're quoting in my previous views, I think one of my experiences, in studying Africa, is that, when you start studying Africa, you read all these books and things like that, and you read lots of social scientists with all these ideas about what goes on in Africa. And then it's only years later you realize that, oh, this is totally wrong. This view is completely wrong. So I would say Jeffrey Herbst's book, for example, States and Power in Africa, is almost completely wrong. He just got it all wrong. And and what can I say? It's a very well written book, and it's easy to believe it, until you actually learn something. Yeah.
All right. So James, we're in a dilemma now. What are the consequences of your research and my prospective research in the future? Is Africa justifying state capacity? Is Africa demonstrating to us that anarchy cannot scale? What should we learn? Because I do agree with you, many authors do contend that there is a rich history of anarchism in Africa, and they often cite the Igbos. So what should we learn from studying the history of Africa?
Yeah,
Are
I don't
the
think
libertarians wrong?
that's not a word. I don't think that's not anarchy. I would think is the right word to use. Like small scale political society. I don't think it was very anarchic. There's all sorts of rules and institutions and You know, so
But
so
quick point, as some scholars will tell you, anarchy is not a synonym for lawlessness. But continue.
yeah, but you know, that's the sort of colloquial usage. You know, I don't use that. You know, you're right. You know, anarchy in the sense of Kropotkin or Proudhon or something meant something totally different, or James Scott. You know, but I think like that, I don't use that word in this context because it tends to create confusion because people have these, you know, kind of
Yeah, they
colloquial.
think anarchy means chaos, but it doesn't.
Yeah, well, in some spheres of academia, it doesn't, you know, but like to ordinary people, you know, if you stood up, you know, in front of an audience in Nigeria and started talking about anarchy, I can tell you what people would think. So, you know, I think you have to think of state, you know, I would say, and this is something I'm also trying to do research on at the moment. You know, and this is also comes from my own experience in Africa, is that like, I think it's a mistake to kind of project Western ideas of what states have to look like, you know, into non-Western situations. You know, like maybe Afghanistan is the best example of that at the moment.
That's anarchy.
But I think that's true in Africa as well. You know, like here's an example, you know, which is you know, one place that's been doing very well in Africa economically for the last 20 years or last 25 years is Rwanda. You know, so Rwanda has been growing very rapidly. It's, you know, there's enormous kind of expansion of infrastructure, investment in education, exporting, all sorts of things. Okay, so how do they do that in Rwanda? How do they actually implement policy in Rwanda? It's really interesting. You know, the main tool that President Kagame and the government uses is what they call the imihigo system, which is, it's sort of like reciprocity. You know, it's kind of like villages and local, you know, people say, you know, they say what we want, you know, what's the problem here? And the government kind of enters into this dialogue with people about, you know, what you need and what we think you should do. And so they use this as a tool of kind of responding to people's, you know, preferences, but they also use it as a tool for kind of getting them to do what they want them to do. You know, stop brewing beer with bananas, you know, start growing these export crops or whatever, or, you know, form these bigger farms, you know, to take advantage of scale economy or these collectives. So, but the way this operates is like not in a sort of traditional bureaucratized way. It's much more, you know, it's as if it's a sort of like social networks. It's much more through social networks, and it's not institutionalized in the way that, you know, we tend to think of state capacity as institutionalized, but it's also incredibly effective, you know. So I think you see that in many parts of Africa, you know, even in the Congo, you know, the DRC, you know, where I've worked a lot, you know, some things like corrupt practices are incredibly organized, you know. It's just the state has huge kind of organizational capacity through these social networks. It's just that it's used for shaking people down rather than doing something productive or kind of moving the society forwards. So I see this a lot in Africa, that many things are organized through these social networks. They could be organized to do something productive, but they're not, you know, but it's not as if there's no capacity. There is capacity. It's just not used in socially desirable ways. You know, what Kagame has done is he's taken these structures that existed and he's used it to start pushing economic development. So I guess one of my current research agendas is actually trying to understand these different senses of state capacity. You know, African states are very good at doing some things, not everything, you know, not everything, but some things that, you know, if you would think about development of Africa, maybe you should start by focusing on things they're good at and sort of leveraging that rather than trying to get them to do things that they're not good at, like raising taxes, for example.
I, I, so James, I'm on the side of smaller government and lower taxes. And again, Africans value autonomy, and I also value autonomy. So I think that the next frontier in research is to well, we don't need to propose ways. By working with Africans, they can propose various policies. But how can we get these autonomous institutions in Africa to scale? I think that's the next big question.
Yeah, I think, you know, you know, if you read Van Sina, you sort of think like, well, Africans are actually very good, you know, at innovating in that sphere. And, you know, And so we should be letting Africans come up with solutions to their problems, rather than sort of prescribing some Western model of like how we think this ought to be done, like some Western model of good governance, because it's not culturally relevant and it doesn't respond to Africans' preferences or their perspectives on their lives. So I don't know what I don't have a policy agenda from that perspective. I think that's, like a fantastic example I use when I teach, for example, is Somaliland. If you look at the history of the last 20 years or 30 years in Somaliland, in the north of Somalia, where they built this kind of state from scratch, basically through a process of negotiation and innovation and creativity. It's a political system which kind of reflects the social structures, the clan system in Somalia, which is legitimate and, which has done exactly what you're talking about. It's not recognized by the international system because they all stay with, there's this thing called Somalia, which the colonial powers it created, and we have to recognize the sovereignty of Somalia. So we can't recognize that Somaliland exists. But, Somaliland is it's sort of what happened in Botswana in many ways. And I think we need to see a lot more of that in Africa. That would be my perception.
Yeah, my proposal is quite simple. Africans should marry what some refer to as polycentric sovereignty with economic freedom. Economic freedom is a robust predictor of growth in Africa. Maybe Africans are the original libertarians. I refer to the Igbos as communal individualists because they're communalists, but at the same time, relative to other peoples in Africa, they're also individualistic. In one of my pieces, I describe them as demonstrating what Deidre McCloskey calls bourgeois dignity.
I think you're right that Igbo people are both sort of very collectivist in the sense that they're very oriented towards community and, but they're also very individualistic, in the sense that, individual economic achievement, for example, is extremely kind of respected and brings high status and, but that sort of, that kind of brings into question this whole distinction between individualism and collectivism, the idea that somehow some societies are supposed to be individualistic and others are supposed to be collectivist.
There are variations. There are several variations. We have vertical individualism, horizontal individualism. Eritrean, before he died, did brilliant work. It's just that most people, when they're writing, don't approach the issue with nuance. So, for example, in my pieces, I do distinguish the various types of individualism, but it's rare for people to write on the matter by being nuanced.
Yeah.
But there are multiple variations, and the research is accelerating. People just choose to ignore it, or maybe due to prejudice. They prefer the individualism collectivism dichotomy. Westerners are individualistic, East Asians are collectivistic. But it's a broader dichotomy.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that I don't find that very explanatory. I don't find those distinctions to be terribly interesting. So if you're proposing a more subtle way of talking about this, then I think that's valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, but the research needs to be enriched by broader learning. Narrow dichotomies will fail to shed light on these fascinating topics. That's why I approach it from a more expansive level. When you do so, you're like, oh my God, I'm flabbergasted. The research is just so rich. And the studies are just growing and growing. But as I said, in the public space, people don't delve deeply into these issues. So, for example, the average YouTuber doesn't care about individualism and collectivism. He's not going to delve deeply into it. He's not going to ask about bureaucracies in Botswana. They're going to say, okay, Botswana, the people in Botswana are rich because they're not as corrupt as other African leaders. That's just a simple narrative of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't, yeah. Yeah.
That's why I started this channel. But James, you're also famous for two brilliant pieces you co-authored with Asimuglu and Simon Johnson. With the reversal of fortune and the colonial origins of comparative development. I've read the papers, but maybe I'm getting the latter name incorrect. There have been several responses to these publications by historians, economists, etc. Jan Lutin van Zanden and Melissa Dell, they did not deliberately respond to your pieces, But both of these writers argue that even in spite of extractive institutions, developing countries can grow. And one African writer in the 90s, he did a study on Zimbabwe, and this writer actually noted that when properly managed, extractive institutions can conduce growth. What is your response to some of your critics?
Well, I don't know. There's a big set of there's a big set of issues there. I mean, uh, I mean, we allow for, I think, what we say about growth under extractive institutions is that it can happen, in some particular circumstances, but it's not sort of sustainable. I don't know exactly what particular arguments by Jan Leuten van Zanden or Melissa Dell you're talking about. I mean, if you look at Melissa Dell's work on the Potosí meter, for example, so she looked at what was the long run effect of this coercive mining institution in Peru. What she found is, in some sense, was very consistent with what we're talking about, which is that places which were subject to the Potosí meter, which was abolished 200 years ago, almost exactly 200 years ago, those places are substantially poorer than places that were not subject to the meter. In fact, household consumption was about a third. It's about a third lower. So that's sort of, I would take, I'd say that's direct evidence that extractive institutions leave a long negative mark in terms of prosperity. So I don't know. Like I think we could talk about specific studies, but it's difficult for me to kind of
Yeah, I get your point. So,
address.
James, my own view is that free market institutions promoting innovation explain long-term economic growth. Extractive institutions can impede growth. So Joel Mokyr, he has done fantastic work on the relationship between the Enlightenment and the depletion of mercantilist values. So I'm not in favor of extractive institutions, but I am skeptical as to extractive institutions as as a long-term explanatory variable. So for example, even in your own work, because I do read your works carefully, you also argue that prior to colonialism, places in the Americas and Africa had extractive institutions. So I'm wondering if we're exaggerating the role of colonial extraction. The Aztecs, they were extractive. Ivor Wilkes, he refers to the Asante Empire as as a mercantilist power. Extraction is the norm in history, not the extraction is the norm in history, not the exception.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of variation in the institutions. I wouldn't think of like pre-colonial Igbo institutions, for example, as being very extractive.
No,
They
I
were,
wouldn't put them in that
and I think
range either.
even within the Americas, like it's true, maybe the Mexicas, were pretty extractive, but there were many societies in Mexico, in kind of Central America, that were not extractive. There were, if you there were very democratic and participatory societies in pre-colonial Mexico. So I think there's variation. There's variation there. I don't remember exactly what we said about that. I think we were just trying to use a kind of we were trying to use variation in the types of societies that colonialism created, as a source of variation in institutions. I think probably that work again, which I did 25 years ago, we probably overemphasizes the impact of colonialism in Africa, or sort of mischaracterizes some of the mechanisms by which colonialism affected Africa. I think it's probably right for the Americas, and it gives you the right explanation, for thinking about the Americas. But we learned a lot about, I mean, I personally learned a lot about the world in the last 25 years. So I think it would
Yes.
be surprising if we'd got everything right 25 years ago.
So, for example, I have a piece responding to your article, and in that piece, I cite these variations that you're referring to. Many writers have been exploring the link between pre colonial institutions and contemporary development in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. And these studies are recent in the 2010s, they're fairly recent studies. Of Cambridge published one titled the effects of colonialism are disappearing, and that was published by a Dutch scholar. And his main point is that the period of colonialism in Africa, it was brief, and that pre-colonial institutions, they're becoming more significant. So I again, maybe you're right, you mischaracterize some of your assertions, but then again, at that time we did not have access to new data. It's and these studies are being churned out quite quickly, and it's becoming more and more evident across regions that pre-modern institutions are crucial. There are some skeptics of this school of thought like Morgan Kelly, but so far I've been reviewing the data. Some studies have been reviewed more extensively than others, but researchers seem to be on to something interesting.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful about interpreting these things. I
Yes.
think it's true, for example, it's true within sub-Saharan Africa that places that had more centralized political systems pre-colonial are more prosperous today. So other things equal. But so that's an interesting source of variation. But I think you have to also think about like, okay, but that doesn't explain why Nigeria, has income per capita of $2,000. That's like you're exploiting the variation, within Nigeria, let's say, to say this bit, which had more
Exactly my
centralized
point.
political,
So it's not a commentary on the national level. So, for example, the
yeah,
Yorubas, they had fairly stronger states. So, on a community level, maybe Yoruba communities are richer than the average Nigerian, but on the national level, it doesn't explain variations in income.
yeah. And I mean, that also that correlation doesn't really, it doesn't really allow, like there's many interpretations of that. That could be a simple story about, the persistence of pre-colonial differences and their consequences, but it could also be a story about how, colonial powers dealt differently with different sorts of African institutions in ways which left a long shadow today. So actually, on the face of it, there's many interpretations of that correlation. I tend to, based on my own research in Africa, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that, that colonialism, Sierra Leone, the interior of Sierra Leone was run by 25 British colonial officials who couldn't speak the language, who didn't really understand the institutions. There's only so much they could do, to kind of transform the society. So many aspects of society in Sierra Leone are kind of deeply rooted in history and pre-colonial history. But the British did create this thing called Sierra Leone, and that had all sorts of perverse consequences, because you had to govern this thing suddenly. You were in the south of Sierra Leone, and suddenly there were these guys in Freetown, and you had to control them, and they create, so I think that, to me, it's really a question of getting the mechanisms right, and I think, I think when we talked about that in those papers, Colonial Origins or Reversal of Fortune, I'm not sure we had the mechanisms right. I think the important thing is to characterize the mechanisms right. And I think there's a lot of ideas in the literature, some of which I think are wrong. And, I like to think I learned something in the last 25 years. Yeah.
We have all learned. Well, I'm younger than you. I'm 27. So I guess I may have more to learn. But James, I reside in a former colony of Britain, Jamaica, and I must say that I have no problem with scholars like yourself researching colonialism, but I'm not particularly convinced by the salience of colonialism as an explanatory variable. Even one writer, Thomas Spears, he argues that we often deny agency to Africans because colonial authorities, they were shaped by African policymakers. Africans were autonomous beings. They weren't sitting and eating and allowing the British to ruin their territories. They had great autonomy. And the period of colonialism in Africa was also quite brief. So I think that colonialism as an explanatory variable is exaggerated. I'm more interested in cost benefit analyses. I more than likely you're familiar with that paper done by William Easterly titled The European Origins of Development. And he argues that, yes, colonialism is not unique to Europeans. The Asante was described as a colonial power by some Africanists, but he argues that on average, the benefits of colonialism outweigh the cost. And I am interested in a study comparing non-European colonialism to Western colonialism because I have the mind of an economist, and I'm not particularly emotional about the perceived trauma of colonialism. I'm just into the data and history. I'm not an emotional person. So I would love to see a study comparing the impact of the imperialism of the Aztecs in comparison to the British or the Spanish. I think that sort of data, yeah, you are those these types of data are quite necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, I don't think, I don't think these are very hard questions to answer in a convincing way empirically. I don't think Professor Easterly kind of, that may be his opinion, but that's just a kind of opinion. I don't think he has kind of really definitive evidence on that. So, I agree with you that Africans had agency, and it's kind of a lot of this literature about kind of the impact of colonialism on African society is sort of, I always thought it's kind
sensationalism.
It's insulting to Africans.
Yes.
Africans, were just kind of putty in the hands of Europeans, which is not true. So I'm sympathetic to that, but I do think colonialism did have systematic, negative effects. I think it's not a coincidence that, these very successful East Asian, development experiences in Japan or China or whatever, like those were places, parts of the world where Europeans didn't colonize, and and somehow so it was easier. I don't know. We can debate this. I think there is evidence, there is systematic evidence that colonialism had very heterogeneous effects on.
Yeah, so Alexander Moradi is no fan of colonialism, but he has a paper submitting that British colonies produce superior academic outcomes. Alexander Lee has a paper comparing British and French colonialism. Akbar has a paper on British colonialism. Clearman has a paper on British colonialism.
Yeah, but there's no clear counterfactual though. We don't know what would have happened, had there been no colonialism. So I understand. I know those studies, but I don't find them evidence that colonialism was a good thing.
No. It's based on the cost benefit analysis calculation. None of these academics have argued that colonialism on average was beneficial. They're just looking at the positive variations. And remember, colonialism is an Asian institution. It is not new to Europe. Europeans did not create colonialism. And again, I live in a colony and I'm a Black person. And it really irritates me, James, when academics do not approach this issue analytically. I don't find it amusing when research is sensationalized, or when people of African descent or those who reside in colonies say, oh, we're poor because we're a colony of the British. I don't appreciate that type of talk. I think it's intellectually inept.
Yeah.
And it insults me as a Black person, because it's saying, okay, you're a slave to your colonial history.
I understand. I get that.
Yeah, so I don't. I'm not defending. I'm a libertarian, and libertarians are not interested in imperialism or colonialism. But if we're going to enhance the quality of public research, we must change the narrative. That's just my simple take. Now, James.
Yes.
We're still on.
We're going to run till we run till 11.
We're going to end soon. We're going to end soon. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I have another meeting.
Yeah, man. I don't plan to keep you long. So James, I'm not asking to comment or critique this piece, but you also did a paper on settler mortality rates, and how do you pronounce his name? David Alboy.
I don't know how you pronounce it. Yeah.
Oh, you don't know. So David Alboy. So he responded to your work, and Valentina A. Asenova and Matthew Rigele, they responded arguing that geography is a better predictor. And again, I'm not asking for a specific response, but do you still stand by your data?
Yeah, we responded at length, to that. I found that exchange very, unproductive. So, we responded at length to that, and I think we convincingly showed that there was no merit in these objections, but I don't have anything to add other than that. I found it totally unproductive. Yeah.
James, my God, you are so harsh.
No, but read our response.
Yeah,
like,
I know I've read it, but most of our readers may not have access. But my last point, James,
yeah.
would you be interested in studying the impact of the Sokoto Caliphate on the development of Nigeria?
I think that would be very interesting. Yeah, what was the impact of the Fulani Jihad? Yeah, I think that's sure. Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I talk about that when I teach. Actually, I have a map of the, there's an interesting connection, between. There's a very famous book by Jack Goody, who's a
Yeah, I'm
social
familiar with Jack
anthropologist,
Woody.
who wrote about cavalry, about the relationship between cavalry and state formation. And actually, the spread of the jihad was inhibited by the instance of the tsetse fly. So I talk about that, and there's a very nice paper by Marcella Alsan
Yeah, I
about
read
the
that
impact
paper
of.
too.
So yeah, I think that's an interesting. There's never been an empirical paper on that to my knowledge, but it's
Yeah,
very
so but
interesting.
you're a pioneer. Next time when you're on the show, we can talk about democracy and ask yourself, do democracies cause growth? But it was a
Yeah.
pleasure to speak to
Okay.
you, James. I thoroughly enjoyed the meeting. But
Okay.
bye, since you have to go. All right.
Okay. Yes. Bye bye.
Yeah, bye bye.